Joining us now on the line from Washington, D.C., Ron Suskind. He is the author of The Way of the World, a story of truth and hope in an age of extremism. And Ron, we're happy to have you on TVO tonight. How you doing?
Just great. Nice to be here.
Pleased to have you. I want to start by reading an excerpt from your book, and it goes like this on the issue of George W. Bush, number 43. Like a high-wire act with no net, Bush made it to the top mostly on pure nerve, which he lost on 9/11. That was visible to anyone who saw him on the tarmac making his first timorous statements and speaking uncertainly at first before the rubble at Ground Zero. This began to turn when he grabbed the bullhorn. By the time he delivered the best speech of his presidency, 2 weeks after the attack, he was rebuilt, a chastened bully who wiped away tears, brushed off the dirt, and was reconstituted by vengeance dressed up as high purpose. There were many people who joined Bush on the campaign in the mid-90s who were really quite inspired, Ron, I think, by his message of bipartisanship and compassionate conservatism. And my first question to you tonight is, what happened to that guy?
Well, I'm not sure how much of that was message or rhetoric and how much of it was really the underlying George Bush that people end up meeting again and again, day after day in the years to come. He was always more or less the guy that people saw in the fullness of his presidency. He's always been a bit of a bully, a lot of bonhomie, good in a crowd, intellectually incurious, but also suffused with real acuity in terms of sizing up people's weaknesses, how to get them to do what he wants them to do as quickly as possible. He's a guy with a kind of nonverbal intelligence that he used again and again. He didn't get to be president by answering an ad in the classified, mind you. He managed to push his way up through crowded rooms of folks who had strong analytical skills and status in the American professional class, though he never really did. He never really managed to move up in the traditional lines of work before he moved into politics. But once he got there, he grabbed the bit, was governor of Texas, and off he went to the most powerful office in the world.
We will talk more in a few moments about how he read body language and why looking into another man's or another woman's eyes was a very important thing for how he made decisions at the end of the day. But I wonder if I could follow up with this. Obviously, his whole world changed on 9/11. There's no question about that. But how do you think his approach to governing changed as a result of what happened on that day?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the history of the Bush presidency, which I've done now in several books, prior to 9/11, he was kind of stumbling along. He was acting in a way that even was causing questions among some senior advisors. Is he really up to this job? There's an interesting moment early on in the presidency where he says to Dick Cheney, geez, you have to stop talking so much in crowded rooms. People are essentially talking to you and they're not talking to me. You've got to step back. And Cheney gets this and he says, all right, fine. I understand, Mr. President. You and I will talk after the meetings. We'll have our regular encounters, our lunches, what have you. But I'll try to speak less when we're together. Part of that was Bush's difficulty in holding the center during a time of traditional governance. Once crisis hits at 9/11, though, and the country says essentially, we can't afford for you not to be even more capable than we ever could have imagined you'd need to be. At that moment, Bush, at a moment of crisis, digs deeply into his architecture, and what emerges is what is later to be called the faith-based presidency. He really had a moment of reckoning. He looked into the deep well of faith, and he emerged with a kind of certainty, a kind of preternatural, almost willed certainty that he was there to carry forward a mission. And that mission would take shape in many ways over the coming years. But that was, in a way, a change, George Bush, I think, after 9/11 in terms of this suffusion of purpose, in a kind of a notion of his special placement as the leader of the free world at a time of what he saw as titanic civilizational conflict and peril.
But that certainty seems to have, even on occasion, flown in the face of facts when they were presented to him. Obviously, the intelligence reports on 9/11 about who was behind it. Saddam Hussein, he thought, weapons of mass destruction, he thought, the intelligence agencies thought, turned out not to be the case. But I wonder whether you think, based on all of the books, you've written 3 books on his presidency, do you think he really believed that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11?
No, I don't think he did. I think the evidence is clear. He was briefed consistently that Saddam Hussein was not behind 9/11. You know, and that's one of the difficulties now with so much still kept in secret about what the president was briefed and when. You know, I think it allows for a kind of toxin to continue to flow through the American body politic. No, the president was briefed early and often that Saddam Hussein was not linked to al-Qaeda, despite the vice president and the vice president's office desire, their ardor, to establish a connection for the convenience, the tactical convenience of being able to drive the American military into Iraq, carried forward by the anger of 9/11. You know, that's demonstrably true. There was no link, and demonstrably true from the briefings early on. So Bush understood what the intelligence was, what it said, and what it did not say, despite his protestations otherwise.
So there has been, of course, a great cottage industry develop psychoanalyzing this 43rd President of the United States. Some people have gone so far, some psychiatric analyses have suggested he's a paranoid megalomaniac with a lifelong streak of sadism. I've seen this in print. The kind of guy who would use firecrackers to explode frogs, or if you want to use the example with Iraq, pumping his fist with glee when the bombs started to fall in Baghdad. Would you go that far in describing him?
No, no. I mean, I don't think he's psychologically, you know, atypical. I think he's a certain kind of character that, you know, people often bump into in the course of their lives. You know, as I said, he was kind of a bully from the start. He was a guy who wanted to get his way, would do what was necessary to get there. He also was a man who'd failed in many things he tried in the first 2 decades of his adult life, and had a very, very strong kind of Oedipal dynamic that defined, you know, frankly, his life from the very start. An imperious and a very successful father who he felt he couldn't measure up to, and he bonded with the 41st president, George Bush I's wife, Barbara Bush, George W. Bush's mother. They formed a kind of bond. W, or Junior, was kind of the black sheep of that family, who then managed to rise. You know, in some ways, that victory in the 2004 election, the psychiatrists would say, was a kind of catharsis for him to finally break free from what he, I think, had long felt was the shadow of his father. You know, but I don't think George Bush is in his way not familiar to people. He's just a certain type of guy you bump into from time to time. What was interesting, though, is how he managed to figure out, though the scion of a dynastic family, how his sort of black sheep status, his sort of, hey, I'm a guy you can go have a beer with, would have such currency in the American firmament. Some of it depending on who he was up against, Al Gore, in that 2000 election, but it really did work. It was a story, a narrative that had great effect. And that's how George Bush became president. Once he got there, though, people started to say to themselves in the White House and elsewhere, geez, you know, analytical skills, that's also important. And every decision that gets to the Oval Office is a hard decision, a complicated one, and it seems like he's having trouble making some of those decisions. It's one thing to be at boardroom tables through your life, as George Bush was, without anything to offer, where, you know, other sort of, you know, Bigfoots of the professional class hold forth. It's another thing for that mahogany table to be in the Situation Room where you're the president and you've got to decide. That's actually a moment of some terror. George Bush felt that early on. After 9/11, though, his impulsiveness, his man of action kind of métier, I'm just going to move forward pell-mell. Actually, that's something the country seemed to, in a way, sort of want, with the complexity and imponderables of that 9/11 moment and the fear and the anger facing them. He embraced that, and he drove America's ship of state forward without any maps, navigation equipment operating. And I think that we're still, in a way, paying the price for those years after 9/11 when we did some things that now, looking back, were not really at the traditional beating heart of the American character.
Well, the president did have his moments with those bon mots. You know, he was not a great speaker, and the malapropisms were flying furious. But here, you've quoted him in your book. the way of the world. Here are his words. We'll share some of this with the viewers here. They murdered people of all colors, the president said, all colors, creeds, and nationalities, and made war upon the entire free world. Since that day, America and her allies have taken the offensive in a war unlike any we have fought before. Today we are safer, but we are not yet safe. On this solemn night, I have asked for some of your time to discuss the nature of the threat still before us and what we are doing to protect our nation. That was a speech, obviously, post 9/11. Some say it was his finest moment. Was this a case of an essentially mediocre guy elevated because of the times in which he found himself?
Well, you know, he certainly rose to the occasion of what people heard and felt confidence from at a time where we really had our spirit crushed. You know, in some ways, the man with flaws who manages to rise above them, which is in a way the story that I think even then people understood about George Bush. You know, his rise will be our rise, his redemption, in a way, the redemption of the country. His anger is anger that many people were feeling. All that actually worked, and it worked at the start in terms of being a man of action. Of course, we go to Afghanistan first. That ends up being something that gets wide sort of consent from around the world. Even folks who are often allied against us were saying, you know, you have a right to do this, and in a way we're with you, including the Iranians and others. You know, those were the glory days of the Bush presidency. But after, if you look at the timeline, February, March of 2002, we don't get bin Laden or Zawahiri, the two main targets, and the president is starting to think, now what do I do? And that's around the time that a lot of the architecture was laid down for the Iraq invasion. He wanted to do that from the first National Security Council meeting, was invade Iraq. But at that point, we officially start the action plan that a year later is ready to go in the early January of 2003 after a year of preparation. So we're ready to invade at that point. It starts right there. And that's where I think the Bush presidency, historians I think will note, kind of goes off the rails, though people may not recognize it until later publicly. That's kind of when it happens. The president had an 89% approval rating in January and February of 2002. And he said, look, I am a giant, and I will move with giant strides however I see fit. I don't even need to give the reason. Good reason, bad reason, or no reason at all. It feels good. This is what my gut tells me to do. I go on instinct, and that instinct will carry us forward. The problem, of course, is you can't run the world from inside the bubble of the Oval Office on instinct. It just doesn't work.
Well, let me follow up on that.
Looking back,
sorry, I was just going to say, I'm going to follow up since you've mentioned the gut here, and we talked about it briefly earlier, but let's go there again. This ability of Bush's to read body language and trust his gut so much. And, of course, the most famous example, I guess, was when he was dealing with the Russian leader, Mr. Putin, and he looked in the man's eyes and got a sense of his soul. Here's the quote from your book. He was warned, and he didn't heed the warnings. In fact, they came months before his famous meeting in June 2001, where he said he felt that he was looking into Putin's soul. He had talked to Putin several times before that, even during the presidential campaign, and he felt the man was his friend. Bush is a guy who needs to make things personal. It's how he always organized a complex world, and he felt that he developed a bond with Putin. And I wonder if you just sort of go into more detail about why this guy so trusted his own gut over, you know, the expert testimony of so many people who'd made studying, for example, Russia or nuclear arms or other adversaries their whole life's work.
Well, it's interesting because often when those folks would do their briefings, they'd realize at some point Bush was sizing them up in a way about what they think of him, of Bush, how they view him. You know, you're an expert. People would come in and later, I talked to, of course, scores of people who briefed Bush. They'd say, why, Mr. President, I'm an expert on this. All of a sudden, they'd see his eyes kind of glaze over. You know, you're an expert, and what does that make me? You know, what, you think you're smarter than me? All right, well, I'm the president. You tell me what you know. What have you got for me? That was kind of the Bush métier. He had very little respect and even some disdain for expertise. Again, for those folks who had succeeded in America's professional class, however, in whatever area. And it's interesting, you know, this notion of trusting your gut, well, it's what got him to the presidency. And so he felt like, you know, as often was the case in his life, he could size people up and manage them. You know, I have a relationship with this guy. We understand each other. Now, what happened early on is foreign policy advisors would say, Mr. President, this is a little different than the country club in Texas. You know, the whole design of their strategy is essentially to create a crafted figure named Putin, just like we kind of try to create one named Bush. You guys may feel bonhomie, you may feel kinship, but a lot of that's manufactured. And ultimately what occurs is when Putin carries forward actions that are in his national interest, Bush felt a kind of betrayal. Like, well, I thought we got each other. I thought we understood each other, and here he is doing something that's tweaking me, that's giving me a shot in the ribs. Bush saw that quite personally. In the same way, he saw Saddam Hussein as a guy who tried to kill his father. He saw Tony Blair as a guy I can deal with. You know, he's taken a fall from me before. He'll do it again. He's a guy I can count on and on. That's the way Bush organized the world. And in some ways, thereby, you know, just like in some of those old Shakespearean tragedies, the character, the impulses, the sort of the personal architecture of a single man will end up defining not only his destiny, but that of a nation. Of course, this is not Denmark. This is America, the world's most powerful country in a world through the Bush presidency that really spun based on the will and the hand, in significant measure, of one man. I mean, just for instance, you know, the notion of personalizing bin Laden and Zawahiri, of lifting them into kind of peer status with the world's most powerful country. Nowadays, people look back and they say, gosh, that was eminently the wrong way to go. Mm-hmm. These men are criminals. They're not in a civilizational struggle with anybody. They're killing women and children, treat them like criminals, get them into a jail, and anyone they know into a jail as quickly as possible, and bring down this rhetoric of a titanic civilizational and twilight struggle. But you know, Bush didn't listen to that, though he was briefed about that even some at the time in the early days. It wasn't what worked for him, wasn't what drove him, wasn't what got his blood heated up, and gave him again the kind of energy that helped him organize action and carry it forward.
I think even his wife gave him heck on that, didn't he? Didn't Laura also say, you overdid it on that one, George?
Well, she often, Laura, it's interesting, she's quite bright and shrewd and well-read, and many times I think she tried to advise her husband to say, you know, well, if no one else is going to tell you, I will. I think you're way off there.
In the book, you write about Dick Cheney's famous quote after 9/11 about how the United States now had to, quote unquote, operate on the dark side. And obviously President Bush agreed with that philosophy. Given that there were no ensuing attacks on the American homeland after 9/11, do you have to conclude that Bush and Cheney were right to want to operate on the dark side?
Well, you know, I actually know a lot about this. Yeah, I wrote about this somewhat in my book just previous to the last one, The Way of the World. The other one is The 1% Doctrine, which came out in 2006. What's really interesting in terms of how the president and the vice president were briefed, what the CIA files showed, is that in 2003, in January of 2003, what we discovered was that there was an operational plan by Al-Qaeda operatives who had cased the New York City subway system, had a device called a Mubtaker, which delivers hydrogen cyanide gas. They were 45 days away from 0 hour, and that attack was called off by bin Laden and Zawahiri. And why? Because it was viewed as not enough, as an appropriate follow-up to what Al-Qaeda felt was the extraordinary, you know, mythic victory of 9/11. Their view and their playbook, which the Vice President Cheney and President Bush know about, was that they have not been actively and operationally attempting to attack the United States in these ensuing years. What is their plan? Let me be very clear here. They are seeking a weapon of mass destruction or some facsimile thereof because they feel that the success of 9/11 has been so great in terms of both the sort of legendary mythos that it is applied and graced Al-Qaeda with, and beyond that, you know, the reactions of the United States in many parts of the world, that the attack which would follow that, whenever that happens, needs to be larger, more significant, more dramatic, to then create an upward arc between 9/11, that second attack, and the years to follow. Remember, terror is what a terrorist does. to create that fear, that expectation of even deeper or greater destruction ahead. That is their playbook. So keeping the country safe for these years, which the president, former president, vice president pat themselves on the back over, is something that they know, based on their briefing and consistent intelligence, is really not something that comports with what the actual evidence indicates. You know, an attack has not been foiled that was operational, and what we really need now is an appropriate focus, which President Obama talks about. You know, on the global hearts and minds battle. That's the only way we're going to keep ourselves safe. You know, when you've got this extraordinary information age where small groups of people can get their hands on the destructive power, technologically speaking, that once was reserved for nations, what you can say to yourself is the old state-to-state dance of force and diplomacy is not really going to be operative. You need intelligence, human intelligence, from people who essentially believe in ideals, not in power and its exercise, but in the ideals that a nation represents. That's what keeps us safe at this time.
Just finally, 50 years from now, what's the lead going to be when a historian who is perhaps 10 years old today writes about President George W. Bush?
Well, I think it's going to be one of a man who in a way, defined himself uniquely, as much as anything, in a kind of conversation with a father, you know, and how I, George Bush, can do what I need to do. I'm making it personal. It's about me and my life, rather than really the life of the country. I think that's the epitaph of the Bush presidency. That in a way, the humility that many presidents feel deep down when they get to that Oval Office is not something he felt. And because of that, he never really evolved in office. He never learned from mistakes and said, look, I need to grow and I need to do better. Instead, he kind of dug in. He went with his gut. He went with instinct. And I think he showed not only the limits, but the perils of that path.
The Way of the World, a story of truth and hope in an age of extremism, is Ron Suskind's latest book. Ron, it's good of you to come on TVO tonight and talk to us about it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.